Radicalization I describe as the process of coming to accept a worldview that positions us versus them in a way that poses the other as an existential threat that has to be fought against. We've heard about children as young as 8 being approached by recruiters in online games to kind of just not initially introduce hateful content, but try to undermine their parents' authority, right? And then gradually kind of groom them toward things that are not in their interest and that they would not ordinarily believe in. And so, it's online gaming, there's the mixed martial arts and the combat sports and fitness world, all of these kinds of spaces, online cooking channels. I mean, any place where people spend time. Extremist groups have tried and individuals have tried and successfully introduced content that's hateful into those worlds. And in that way are intersecting with other people's hobbies and finding them in those places and then bringing them in. So does that mean that every gym, every fitness club has, become an extremist? Of course not. But that all of those mainstream spaces and places become opportunities or gateways where people can begin to spread extremist content and then draw people in. I would say 25 years ago, it was a destination that you had to seek out. You had to sign up, even in the early days of the internet, you had to sign up for a listserv. You had to sign up for a mailing list, you had to request information, or you had to know somebody. There was a one-on-one, somebody who would take you along to a backwoods gathering or a Ku Klux Klan meeting or something to really be brought into these groups. Today, I think it's just the opposite. It is much more likely that this propaganda, this disinformation, dehumanizing hate comes to you wherever you are online. And so I often describe it as, everyone is really just 2 clicks away from an ever-expanding ecosystem of online hate and manipulation, just because of the way that hyperlinks work, the way that algorithms work that recommend content that someone else has watched, and the way that salacious clicks, salacious titles, so that they get more views and then that gets recommended more to people. So, you can be I've seen makeup tutorials that are expressing anti-Islam content, but getting around the algorithms by writing the hateful content in lipstick on someone's face. If you're getting to the level of being an actual recruiter or a propagandist for one of these groups, you're fully on board and you believe deeply that, in fact, I would even argue that they find, as we know, a sense of deep meaning and purpose in it, that this isn't just about hate, that it's about brotherhood and belonging for them and enacting a sense of purpose toward a world that they believe is the one that they should be working toward. So there's a lot of kind of heroic impulse in this across the ideological spectrum that we have seen. And so most of what I've seen is that especially youth get attracted for those emotional qualities as a place to provoke, as a place to rebel, and as a place to find belonging and meaning and purpose. And then the ideological stuff comes later. But, that's what happens on the recruitment side. But I would say most of the exposure today is not through deliberate recruitment, but rather through some other group of kids in your school sharing a meme that denies the Holocaust or expresses scientific racism or shows an extreme misogynistic message, in a joke form. Or in an emoji site or an anime sharing site, right? Places where kids spend time, they encounter a lot of hateful content couched as jokes that they then spread with each other, they share with each other because they think they're funny. And they've been kind of coached or taught in a way through other exchanges online to see the reactions of the mainstream as just a group of triggered snowflakes who can't take the joke, right? So in so doing, that entire youth ecosystem has kind of positioned itself, the far right, this is the far right youth, as countercultural to the mainstream. They're the edgy ones who are provoking the others who can't take a joke. So there's sort of 2 things happening at the same time. There are actual recruiters out there, but I would say that's the minority of what we're talking about. The much bigger problem, in my view, is the persuasive tactics of people who are just sharing content that they think is edgy or provocative or hateful, it may be hateful, and misogynistic or trolling people or doxing people, engaging in all of those kinds of bad behaviors online, essentially, and interacting in a kind of cesspool of other people, of comments and hateful content that dehumanizes, that desensitizes them, that they then are arguing is just a joke. So they have that plausible deniability. It's pretty well documented now in multiple intelligence threat assessments that the far right is posing the biggest threat on the national security front in terms of plots foiled, investigations by the FBI. The actual lethality over the last few years has all been growing rapidly from both the anti-government extremist fringe and the white supremacist extremist fringe. I should say I use the term far right as an umbrella term. I often call it the best bad term we have available. I don't like it very much, but I don't like the alternatives either. It is a term that I use to refer both to the authoritarian and anti-democratic anti-government extremist movements and the supremacist movements, which include both white supremacist movements, but also male supremacists, Christian supremacists, Western supremacists. So a hierarchy of supremacy, superiority and inferiority that dehumanizes another. The most dangerous is white supremacist extremism, but we have had rising incel violence. We have Western chauvinist Proud Boys who are promoting a Western supremacism. There's a lot of different types of supremacy that animate these movements that are also dangerous. On the supremacist side, I would say they are linked together by the idea that their group, however they define it, is superior to another group. Often that's in biological terms, but sometimes civilizational terms or religious terms. So male supremacy, Christian supremacy, white supremacy, heteronormativity, right? All of these kinds of things that position not just a hierarchy of superiority and inferiority, but one that positions the other as an existential threat that has to be thwarted, typically with violence. So really, when you see things like the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, when you're really looking into threats to that compare the experience of white people in the United States, for example, to the Native American experience and suggest that there will be a genocide because of immigration and that white people will end up on reservations. That's what I'm talking about when I say existential threat. It's a serious and a real sense that there is a call to action to thwart. And it's embedded, there are versions of it that don't rise to that level of violence or threat, but that underpin it, that create the fertile ground. And things like misogyny and racism underpin those and create the fertile ground. So you have to combat that as well. You can't actually treat this problem the same way we have treated other problems of extremism or terrorism, whether or not we think those were effective at all to begin with, right, which is a whole separate set of questions. The treatment of previous eras of extremism and terrorism in this country anyway, and globally, really has been about bounded groups that could be surveilled and monitored and infiltrated, and really a securitized approach, which had its problems, of course, with civil rights and with bias, and also with effectiveness. But in this case, you can't, how are you going to surveil, a meme site, right? Like you can't, and if there's nothing illegal happening, but it's racist or exclusionary or supremacist content that gradually draws someone in a case like that, instead of focusing on the fringe, to turn your eyes toward the mainstream itself and focus on building resilience within the mainstream, to be less receptive, less susceptible, less vulnerable to the propaganda. And this is the approach the Germans call defensive democracy after World War II, the idea that there will always be a fringe producing hateful content and propaganda, and you'll never be effective as a democracy if you only keep your eyes on the fringe. You also have to bolster the mainstream against them. It's not to say that you ignore the fringe. You have to pay attention. Some of them become violent, and it's important to stop that, of course. But you can't only do that. You also have to improve digital and media literacy, bolster people's awareness of scapegoating and fear-mongering and other kinds of persuasive tactics, understand how conspiracy theories work. It turns out, actually, most conspiracy theories have pretty much the same scaffold. Like there's always an orchestration, there's always a cabal of elites. Once you teach people about that, as we found, they can recognize other conspiracy theories and they're more resilient and less likely to believe them. After 9/11, we all take off our shoes and we throw away our bottles of water and shuffle, through the security checks with no belts and have just accepted that, right? But how far do we go down that path of securitized worlds? This is what I was talking about earlier when I said, before that has an impact on your soul, right? You start to accept that securitized approach. So some of it is coming back to the mainstream and just remembering that you don't put all your resources on addressing the fringe, you also bolster the mainstream. I think in this country we had something like 110 domestic terror plots last year, and 21 of them were interrupted, right? So we're lucky that the rest of those 89 attacks weren't bigger, right? But they were successful. So to some extent, those securitized approaches catch some of the attacks and the plots, and they interrupt. And the governor of Michigan didn't get kidnapped, right? I mean, there are plots that get interrupted, and I'm glad that they do. And certainly we need some focus on that. Of course, there has to be accountability, but it's this total focus on accountability does a couple of things. One, even after something like January 6th, the entire focus is on the investigations instead of on what can we invest in to prevent people from believing that kind of disinformation. And I think that also leaves victims of hate, people who have experienced the other side of that dehumanizing, feeling like hollow, basically. If you're just focusing on accountability without the solidarity, without the commitment to ensure that that fertile ground is not there for a next attack to happen, right? For a next hostage-taking situation or an attack on a mosque or a synagogue or a church, a black church, right? I mean, these are the things that we've been seeing. So obviously the surveillance and the interruption of plots doesn't seem to help prevent the next one from happening. In this country, our definition of prevention essentially has come down to how good we are at barricading the doors. But that's not the world that I want to live in, right? I don't think it's the world that you want to live in, where that's what it means to prevent violence, is to train ourselves to, have our kids hide under desks in schools, right? Or make themselves small in the bathroom or the closet or whatever the training is that we decide we need to provide to create that securitized world. We're in a world where we need that security training, sadly, but we also, what does that do to the soul, right? What does that do to someone's humanity and to our humanity? And we're trying to equip people to be more resilient to propaganda, to counter disinformation, to recognize conspiracy theories, to react to hate incidents with solidarity and not just accountability, to reduce the fertile ground in which hate can thrive, to understand that you can protect free speech and combat hate speech at the same time, right? So we had all these things that we kind of broke down and said, instead of just coming at it as, it's sort of like, what if instead of combating polarization, we are trying to improve social cohesion, right? What if instead of, right? So what if for each one of the things that we work on, we try to remember what it is that we're also trying to build? And I think that the way that I think of polarization relating to extremism and to radicalization is that polarization, which is also a kind of us versus them way of thinking, and which people move further and further away from each other and become fixed in their positions and are unwilling to or unable to see the humanity of the other, but also engage collaboratively on shared interests because they're so fixed in their positions. Extreme polarization, starts to bleed into real hatred of the other and can be easily mobilized, I would say, into some of this anger. So some of the political violence that we've been seeing in the States, I wouldn't characterize as extremist in the traditional way that we've understood extremism, but it's certainly extremist in terms of an extreme form of polarization that then maybe spontaneously morphs into a moment of extremist violence, an attack on a healthcare worker, a death threat against an election worker, a violent assault on a school teacher because a child has been told to wear a mask. So those are kinds of moments of political violence that are really quite different from the way we have thought about extremist violence, but they fall in the same category of polarization that then spontaneously moves. And I would say some of January 6th did as well. So, January 6th was a strange event because we had a huge coalition of extremist groups there who normally don't cooperate with one another. So, white supremacists, but also the unlawful militias and the Proud Boys were there and the QAnon conspiracy theorists and anti-vaxxers. And, then you had ordinary Trump voters who were highly mobilized that day. There was obviously some extreme planning in advance by some organized extremists, but there also was a lot of spontaneously mobilized violence. And that's the kind of violence I think that comes out of extreme polarization. and where polarization and extremism and start to meet. There are conditions that make extremist ideas and tendencies and ideologies more likely to take root. And that's that fertile ground kind of thing, right? And so when the Germans, for example, created a 1 billion euro initiative to combat far-right extremism a couple of years ago, it's called the 89 Measures to Counter Anti-Semitism, Racism, and Right-Wing Extremism. So it's understanding that in order to counter the extremist fringe, you also have to counter and not just counter, you have to promote equity. You have to address issues of social inclusion. You have to improve social cohesion, and that you can proactively work to create the positive outcomes that you want within the mainstream, within society, as a strategy for reducing the likelihood that people are going to be attracted to the fringe. In New Zealand, after Christchurch, a very similar strategy has taken hold, where many of the initiatives coming out of the Christchurch report are focused on building equity. It's a combination of these things. In the US, we never do that, right? We never link these two things. Countering racism, even countering structural racism, there was a commission, I think, under the Biden administration to initially to talk about issues of structural racism. But that commission, as far as I know, has nothing to do with the domestic violent extremism work that's happening, that's led mostly by folks on the intelligence side or in the national security world, right? So it's these conversations, and of course then the conversations around racism themselves right now are highly polarized and highly contentious. And so that just leads back into that feedback loop of polarization as well. So it's a complex story. I don't think there's a linear thing. It's more like a fertile ground situation, trying to imagine a world in which certain kinds of things are able to take root and thrive.